Hello, welcome to the There's Something Missing from Assessments of ID Fraud Risk webinar with Eva Velasquez, CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center, and Jim Van Dyke, co-founder of Breach Clarity. I'm Alex Hamilton, the Digital Communications Specialist at the Identity Theft Resource Center, and I'll be moderating the next 30 minutes. A little bit about Eva. Eva is the president and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. She previously served as the vice president of operations for the San Diego Better Business Bureau and spent 21 years at the San Diego District Attorney's Office. Eva is a recipient of the National Crime Victim Service Award from the Department of Justice and OVC. Jim serves as an expert witness in many of the nation's largest data breaches. He has provided expertise in some of the most significant U.S. cases, including Anthem, Equifax, and Yahoo. Jim founded Breach Clarity out of a passion to more authentically and effectively improve consumer financial health and well-being. Previously, Jim founded Javelin Strategy and Research and served as its CEO for 12 years. At the end, we'll have some time for Q&A with our presenters. And if you have questions, you can email us at communications@idtheftcenter.org. Without further ado, let's get started. Eva, please take it away.
Thank you, Alex. If you can go to the first slide, please. Thank you, everyone, for taking some time out of your busy schedules to discuss what's missing from assessments of ID fraud risks. The Identity Theft Resource Center is a 501c3 charity organization established in 1999, and this is our mission. Now, we're well known for our free victim services, but as you can see, our mission includes not only empowering victims and consumers, but businesses and government as well. Next slide, please. We take a holistic approach to addressing identity crimes. In addition to our free recovery and remediation services, we're also very active in the research and the data breach space. And we've used the knowledge that we've gained over the last 20 years to create some new service offerings for all of our stakeholders. Next slide, please. Now, we've always used our research to inform the public, but we also use it to inform our internal best practices. In our Aftermath series, we survey the identity theft victims that we assisted in the previous year, and we do a deep dive into the impact of identity theft victimization. We look at the emotional, the behavioral, and even the long-term downstream impacts as well. And we recently expanded our identity theft, the Aftermath research, to include victims as well. Next slide, please. Now, to accomplish this survey, we contacted the people that had contacted us for the Equifax breach. Not that we're purposefully calling out one single organization. It was simply that we had received thousands of calls from the public regarding this event, and we really wanted to understand what they were feeling 1 year later. After surveying them, we found that the emotional impacts were strikingly similar to identity fraud victims. The feelings that people experienced were the same for a compromise of their data as it was for the actual misuse of their data. These are just a few of the comments that were made by some of our survey respondents. Those feelings of not being able to trust, feeling violated, not feeling like they had any control, and feeling anxious. These are very similar to the responses that we received from our core Aftermath series respondents. Next slide, please. But the reaction that remains unique for data breach victims, it's a question really, and it's far and away the most common one that our advisors receive from folks calling when they call us after they receive a data breach notification is, but what does this actually mean to me? They may have the notification in front of them with all of the details of what was compromised. So they actually have all the pieces of the puzzle, but they don't yet have the ability to put those pieces together and form a good picture of what this event means, or more importantly, what the next move or next steps should be. Next slide, please. So we realized that we needed to do more to help both individual consumers and businesses better understand their risks post-breach. And we also wanted to help more people. So after a complete revamp of our data breach database, we developed some new solutions. We are providing tier 2 call center support for businesses that want to provide that additional one-on-one assistance to their customers. And we developed Notified. It's our comprehensive searchable database with 15 years of details about publicly reported data breaches that helps businesses plan for attacks and conduct due diligence on their vendors and partner organizations. Next slide, please. With Notified for consumers, we're continuing to provide free information to these folks where they can find and discover information on publicly reported data breaches, such as the name of the breached entity, the number of individuals impacted, when it was reported, and the industry sector where it occurred. We purposefully kept this information concise so as not to overwhelm them. And also because after 15 years of doing this, we know what they find to be the most meaningful and useful. And they can also access our data dictionary and those terms, where they can look up the specific terms and what they mean and understand the common language that's used to describe breach events and outcomes. We find this very important for our educational mission because we're hopeful as people are introduced to this language more and more, they can walk away with that knowledge. So when they encounter it in the future, they can actually make some interpretations about what they're reading. Now, in addition to the free version for consumers, we created Notified for businesses. As you know, increasingly, state laws require companies to hold their vendors to the same high privacy and cybersecurity standards they need to meet. And Notified helps organizations to plan for data breach trends and conduct that due diligence on vendors and partners and ensure that they do not represent a breach risk. And of course, the reasonable fee that we charge businesses for subscriptions to Notified all goes back into helping support our free victim and consumer services. Next slide, please. But remember when I said we still wanted to help more people? In addition to the efforts that I just mentioned, we realized that the only way we could do that was through more meaningful partnerships. And through the combined efforts between ITRC and Breach Clarity, this has allowed us to create more useful and easier to use tools for consumers. By combining the ITRC data and Breach Clarity's expertise in developing data-based risk scores, we've been able to amplify those one-on-one call center services and provide the same level of detailed risk analysis and risk minimization through online services. Individuals can visit the Breach Clarity website, access their risk score of any particular breach, a list of potential harms, and risk minimization action plan. Of course, if they need help at any step along the way, implementing those recommendations, they're still able to reach into the ITRC advisors through either our toll-free number or through our live chat. I'm really proud of all of the work and frankly the amazing outcomes that ITRC and Breach Clarity have been able to accomplish. And while we're doing some great things separately, this is something that we did together, and it's just changing the way that the public thinks about and responds to data breach events. So I am thrilled with the progress we've been able to make and the impact that we've had on the public good. And with that, I will hand it off to my co-presenter and frankly good friend, Jim Van Dyke. Jim?
Thanks, Eva. And I can't say enough about how much I and all of us at Breach Clarity appreciate the partnership with the ITRC. You've been running your organization for so long and helping so many victims, and your reputation is really unsurpassed in terms of being a concerned force that provides real action and help and empirical data, independent data on behalf of victims everywhere. So what's missing, the reason we chose the title for this webinar, what's missing between in today's data breach assessment is clarity. So as Eva explained, understanding how when data compromise occurs, how does that particular data breach, how does it increase risk of particular kinds of fraud? There are 12 different frauds in the unique model we put together that ties in with DOJ, FTC, Javelin, all these other sources of fraud research, and certainly the ITRC. And we cover every major type of identity credential and 51 action steps, as I'll explain a bit in a moment. So on the next slide, talking a bit about the value proposition, because I think, first of all, starting out with some easy things, I think everyone would agree. The data compromise is what makes identity theft, scams, and fraud possible. And really, to be clear, if you got rid of data breaches and data compromise, you'd get rid of all identity crimes. All identity criminals would be stopped in their tracks. So we can't do that. But what we can do is increase clarity. So now we empower individuals and we strengthen the ability of the organizational leaders in places like financial institutions, tax authorities, employers, and so forth, to be able to work both independently and in concert, finally, with the identity holder to stop more fraud and shorten that distance. So the problem as we see it is there's an epidemic of data breaches creating a widespread identity theft, scams, and fraud. So they're on an average US day from the ITRC database, there are 3 to 4 new data breaches. And the problem is that every one of them, like a fingerprint, creates a unique pattern of fraud. Most of this identity fraud and theft, origination, card fraud, ATO, that's account takeover and other things, occurs in retail financial services, totaling 39 billion by our projection. And so consumers, some people say consumers are lazy or unmotivated, and our data show that nothing could be farther from the truth. We're constantly blaming the victims, the consumers, when in fact, the consumer or the spend on retail identity protection services products, LifeLock and so forth, is 4 billion a year. That doesn't sound like the work of unmotivated people. But those solutions, identity protection solutions, really don't connect with the tools that financial institutions and others, and even the FTC and the tax authorities have put out designed to help identity holders change their behavior. What Breach Clarity does is bridge that gap or bring clarity. So we convert every single data breach instantaneously through AI, through our algorithms, into identity fraud risks. So when we see a breach, you just name the breach, like Equifax, we'd say, well, that's fraud type number 1, fraud type number 2, fraud type number 3 in priority order in terms of risks. And here's the action steps that consumers need to take. Finally, with this clarity that you won't find certainly in a breach notification letter, in a sense of, it's like a prescription that you would expect from your doctor instead of these crazy one-size-fits-all prescriptions that every single financial institution is giving their customers and members today. And then they wonder why people don't take action. Well, that will give people a prescription for action, but we do have a free site, breachclarity.com. Anyone can use it anytime. You might wonder, why are you giving away a free version? Well, we're creating the global Richter scale of data breaches. Starts in the US, later we'll go to the 30 countries we've filed patents on. And really the big winning opportunity is for this database to be running through our algorithm and connected to commercial dark web providers so that we allow people at the place where fraud is most likely to occur to finally, again, get this customized prescription. So this boosts everyone's financial health, it cuts losses. It can even be a revenue model if people want to charge for an advanced version of it. But we don't think that credit unions and banks will charge for the basic one because they're lowering their own costs. Same goes for identity protection firms that we're eager to work with. So on the next slide, let's get into an example of what this looks like before we actually jump into the product. So if you take any 2 people, literally any 2 people, there's no question they have a unique data breach history. So why don't we acknowledge that? Well, that's one of the big areas of clarity we're lacking. Let's just take the woman on the left and assume she was in the breaches mentioned in the bubble above her. First American Title, Bronx Health, and Yahoo. If you ran each of those breaches through breachclarity.com, you could do it right now, and you would get separately unique fraud risks. We only show a couple of risks and a few action steps, and the full product that will be licensed through financial institutions and identity protection firms. You'll start to see that in just a few months. We have people who are moving quickly toward rolling the product out soon. We would see those breaches as being a series of risks and actions, whether they're separate or together. We would give this individual and her financial provider kind of a portfolio view and saying the woman in red, whatever her name is, she's at risk of ETO, account takeover number 1, new credit account origination number 2. Those are very different crimes that require different credentials And our algorithm uses the exposed credentials that comes from the ITRC database. Say, well, these credentials are exposed. They're like keys that unlock certain locks. What are those locks? And for certain kinds of locks that are now at greater risk, what action steps best mitigate those risks? Those are the actions. So with this example, you can see here the person in the tan and then the woman in the middle whose back is to us, the woman in the green coat, and so on. Every one of them has unique breaches, therefore unique risks and unique action steps. That's the point of breach clarity. And just like you would run for the hills if your doctor gave you the same prescription as everybody else in the waiting room, you said, why in the world do I have a prescription for Xanax? I have a cut on my arm. This makes no sense. You would be outraged and you'd be calling the authorities. Why aren't we doing that today when we get one size fits all advice? This is why we have so much fraud, and this is why we have disinterested consumers. On the next slide, again, they're not disinterested. I actually should correct myself. There are people who spend $4 billion a year are not disinterested. They lack clarity. So on the next slide, somebody actually retweeted this already who was in the webinar. So I want to just point it out that this is a big deal. Imagine that if people are worried about anything, tsunamis, viruses, whatever, and the ones they're most worried about are the least dangerous. That also describes today's situation. The average small breach of under 1 million records, when we simply cut the database that we get from the ITRC and run through our algorithm, we found the average small breach has an average breach clarity score. That is the score on 1 to 10 basis that predicts how likely that fraud is to create losses for the consumer who was affected. The average score was almost 4 on a 1 to 10 scale. For the small breaches, for the average breach that had 1 million plus, it was only 2.6. So that average is even breaches like OPM that were nearly a 10, and Anthem that was, I think, a 7 or 8. So the point is, the breaches nobody is worried about are the ones they should be worried about, and vice versa. And this can be changed by getting people not to focus on size, but the risk severity. So on the next breach, we can do some other cool things with the data. And that is, we can predict future fraud likelihood. So we ran every breach that is in the ITRC database through our algorithm for the last 18 months. And what we found was for the last 4 or 5 or 6 months, there was a bubble that went up and then it tapered back down again on card fraud, breaches that primarily raised risk of card fraud. And there was a corresponding decrease in new credit account origination, that is new credit loans. So it'll be interesting to help organizations predict what kinds of fraud should be different, how they change fraud filters, how they warn consumers in different ways, like the equivalent of a tsunami and one kind of fraud is coming, but in other areas, you can let your guard down a little bit. So on the next slide, let's talk about how this actually plays out. A breach clarity is about real identity protection. And I say this as a former CFPB board member, where the first action of that agency was to actually find a few of the less ethical identity protection efforts going on out there. And there's some great companies doing important work. And I personally have chosen to buy some of these products. Some people should, they're not right for others, but the point is that we just give recommendations. We don't actually resell credit monitoring or password managers. We don't do any of that. But we do, among our 51 recommendations, 31 of them, what we do is provide 33 recommendations that relate to preventing fraud, that is never letting it happen in the first place. And the ones in bold on the left side box, the one that's in red, the ones that are in bold are generally provided by credit unions and banks, and they're desperate to get people to take action. They're thinking people are unmotivated. And again, the only reason they don't take action is because they get bad advice and one-size-fits-all advice everywhere they turn. The remaining 1/3 of our recommendations relate to detection. Again, we have no intention of ever providing these tools. And on the right side, we're a complement to other things like identity theft insurance, which I think all the vendors feel they have to provide, or remediation help with notary public services and all sorts of other things. So on the next slide, how does the product work? I've mentioned this algorithm. That's what I wrote for my expert witness work. I said, I'm helping attorneys win lots of cases, but I need to move this to be a tool that's implemented for identity holder use at the place where fraud is likely to happen. Banks, credit unions, we hope one day tax authorities and so forth. So flowing through this algorithm on literally a daily basis is data from, on the left, the Identity Theft Resource Center. Well, there are 3 to 4 breaches in a typical day. And dark web data providers. We work with one very high quality vendor. We're open to work with any of them. And from that, we build the consumer's breach history. So everybody has a unique breach history, just no one knows what it is today. We help them build it. We assume most people won't remember where they were breached. And out the other side of this algorithm in real time comes a series of products or UIs. The Premium Now products, the one runs in what's called microservices. So kind of like when you're a financial services site, you're logged in, but you can tell you're going to a different website that was basically placed there. Our product comes in a version like that. And the reason we did that in secure form behind the firewall, but not integrated, is so people can implement it in literally a couple of weeks, just changing the graphics. And we maintain just about all of it. Or they can fully integrate it, use their own version of the front end, again, behind the firewall. And why would they license a product they have to pay money for? Because their own fraud goes down. Their consumer, remember, is healthier. And they can even charge for some portions of the identity protection that bring integrated value to the FI, not disconnected value. On the right side are some products that we'll be releasing in fall late this year and then into early next year. So on the next slide, I mentioned that we have taken out international patents. We filed patents in 30 countries because our mantra is always, or the question we always ask is, what's best for the identity holder? That is our core principle. So we believe it's best for people if they don't have the equivalent of Fahrenheit and Celsius times 100 or times infinity actually today, where no one has clarity on what a breach means to fraud risk. But instead, they could just use a tool around the world for any data breach to find out what it means to fraud risk and what action steps represent the best value for them and their various providers. So if we could go 2 slides more to the one that says Freemium in the upper left, this is what you get on our free website. And we provide it for free, just like other freemium offerings, Spotify, what have you, running apps, because we are about financial health. So you can type any breach in there. Take the one you most recently received a notice on. Those notices are all pretty much confusing. You type it in, and for free, you find the high-level risks and the action steps. But they are super high level. So on the next slide, we get into the a little more depth of the product. If you're a financial provider or some other provider, or you're a reporter and you'd like a walkthrough of the product, just reach out to me, show my email address at the end, and we're happy to take you through the full product. We even have a few financial institutions who we've given full access to the complete product now, so they can look at it on their own time. So the premium product feature, you just simply log in. If you're logged into your credit union or bank, this would be what the landing page might look like. I mean, you ultimately decide. There'd be a breach clarity logo if you wanted it there, and it would tell you how many new identity exposures they've found on the dark web and steps you can take to protect your identity, because we are all about the action. So on the next slide, if you're going further into breach clarity itself, you would see the same donut wheel for a particular breach. That's the Yahoo one in the upper middle. It's that same kind of imagery going on behind, again, after you've logged into breach clarity. I'm sorry, you're already logged in because you've logged into your bank or credit union. But in the upper right, the risks will be greatly multiplied. They could go out to as many as 12, but in a very calm, trust-building way that just drives people to take action. And then on the far right, you get some status updates showing whether or not you've completed the recommended action steps. And there are as many as 51. That might seem overwhelming, but the point is, no one sees 51. We just show people the few that are of the highest priority, number one, and remain to be done with status information fully integrated with the bank's technology stack. if that's what they want. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have a lot of risks listed there. They go far beyond the free site. And the next slide, going one more, there are, this goes a little deeper into the action steps that are available to people. So the financial institution's own logo would actually be shown here, indicating that some of the controls that FIs, financial institutions, again, are desperate to get people to use. The adoption of these controls generally is 10% or lower for things like two-factor auth or what's called 2FA or account activity alerts, especially by text. Will allow integration or enable to where you can actually click on the button here and you don't have to go out to a system setting menu, which is where most people just stop in their tracks. And we make it super easy to turn these controls on that drive fraud down and build that stronger partnership, build the greater loyalty. So the next slide shows the dashboard one more time, and you'll see where we have setting up 2FA, two-factor auth with a completed green light. We're just trying to take fraud from this scary topic that's used by a few of the less reputable identity protection firms and lots of hype-oriented articles into something that the most reputable firms in the industry can use to protect the same customer or member who is the face of modern day bank robbery. You know, most fraud losses in banks are happening through the consumer. So let's build that tighter partnership. So with that, we'll go to the last slide here, which says how you can contact me. I would be delighted to hear your questions by email. And if we have a couple of moments now, I can even take any questions that might be coming up.
Well, thank you, Eva and Jim. And we can cover a few frequently asked questions about breach clarity. So Jim, for example, how do you account for tax refund fraud and medical identity theft?
In the case of those types of fraud, which often are really confusing for people because, you know, like say in the Anthem breach, it primarily was a healthcare firm. It primarily raised risk of new financial account origination and tax refund fraud. How did our algorithm reach that determination? Well, it's because the credentials that were exposed are most likely to enable those two types of crimes: the social security number, income information, things that an identity criminal need. So we have the 12 different forms of fraud, and they're all based on us, you know, my own industry expertise and that of my partner, in interviewing lots of banks and people at the tax authorities and other organizations. So they'll all be in there, and we'll be constantly modifying our algorithm to adapt to all forms of fraud, including the two you asked about.
Great. And how do you differentiate between free and paid consumer actions like credit monitoring services versus going to your annual free credit report?
We will list them all, and you know, I'm a firm believer that there is some value in some of the services that are available for a fee, but it doesn't make sense, as I said earlier, for some people to use those. And we want to make sure we let people know about everything. And some of the best free services, really some of the very best, are those available at the credit union or bank that no one's using or no one knows about, or people get bewildered by. They lack clarity. So we'll list them all. We will always keep a 2/3 focus on prevention, 1/3 on detection. And our goal is just to give people the greatest value. Again, that's our core principle, by showing them all and just simply listing them in priority of what's likely to create the greatest value or the greatest impact in reducing fraud risk, not what's free versus fee.
Excellent. And before we end, do you have anything else to add, Eva or Jim?
I hope people will reach out. We'd love to learn from others, and we'd love to hear questions. Eva, anything from you?
Basically the same sentiment. We are a free consumer service. If there are any individuals listening that need some direction or guidance, just remember that the ITRC never charges consumers or victims for their services. And, you know, please stay engaged. Send those follow-up questions.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Have a great day.